Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be working on a Wolverine drawing as Weapon X. For those of you who don't know what Weapon X is, it's a comic run by the artist and writer Barry Windsor Smith, and it focuses on Logan and sort of how he became the Wolverine that most of us know him as, which is bonded to the Marvel metal adamantium. There's a really great channel on YouTube here called like Russian Comic Book Geek, and they do a voice acted comic book version of it, and it is super good. And so if you have any interest in the story, or even just want to revisit it in a way that is different than maybe how you took in the story the first time, I really recommend it. But yeah, so the Weapon X is sort of the, I don't know if it started out this way or is intended that way, but it's kind of become, in my mind, the de facto origin story for Logan. He's taken to a remote area in the wilderness, a laboratory where he's experimented on by, there's kind of three people the story follows around, which is a guy that's just only known as the professor, and Cornelius, who's actually kind of the head scientist. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the girl's name. I don't know why it's escaping me. But there they experiment on Logan, and the story is actually kind of confusing. It starts off fairly basic. It's just these people in a sort of soulless way watching this process happen to them and remarking on its effectiveness, and they're trying to eliminate Wolverine's or Logan's humanity so that he can become this Weapon X, which it's not really understood inherently why this needs to even happen, a Weapon X. I'm looking at my hand here because I have Logan's hand balled up, and so I'm kind of trying to see the wrinkles and how they form. I do that a lot. I just use my own body for deciphering, how wrinkles should go. At least while I'm still a reasonable age. I'm sure as time goes on, my body won't hold up to being a great reference for some of these things, but this is also, so I did this sketch, I guess 7/18/25, kind of inspired by Barry Windsor Smith, and if you've seen the artwork in the Weapon X book, he uses a lot of like blues and pinks, and so I just wanted to use my blue colored pencil and do it. In this pose, I'm actually fairly happy with how it turned out. This one, not so much. This is a good lesson for people who are into drawing of why it's important to kind of think about what we're copying, even if I'm just copying from myself, and not just copy for the sake of copying. Because I kind of just copied trying to get a video out, a drawing ready on a page here, and I forgot why exactly my decision making on this pose, and I basically wanted the look of a uppercut by a like a boxer, and so I have the elbow raised a little bit like he's throwing it upward, and his body's twisting, because when you throw an uppercut, you're kind of supposed to leverage your posture beneath it. And here I did not get the elbow up enough. The thrust of it should have been out more this way, and so now he's just kind of holding his arm out there in front of him, so it's not going to be as dynamic of a pose, and it's probably going to end up looking a little stiff. So that's just kind of unfortunately something that happened, because I wasn't paying attention to the reasons why I had done it that way, and I had only remembered after I drew this and thought, why does it look a little stiff? And I might be able to make it look like something. Maybe it won't even be anything bad, but just a good reminder of when you're drawing something, think of the reasons why things were done a certain way. You know, the arm being up would have put the rest of the body beneath it, like he was really grounding himself so that he could drive the force of the motion upwards. And you know, obviously this could be a moment you catch in a photo of an uppercut. You know, your arm does have to travel this path, but you know, I kind of always heard that in art you're not trying to capture necessarily the mundane part of the path or the stiffest part of the path. I mean, you could, it's something that happens in photos and whatnot, but what makes the photo or the art good is capturing the motion that gives it, capturing the moment in a time in which it shows a lot of motion or dynamicism or things like that. And so this drawing, like I said, might end up being a little stiff. But back to Weapon X, I mean, the artwork in it is super fantastic. The more and more I draw and try and move beyond like just drawing portraits or things like that, the more I've come to respect exactly what comic book artists do when they, I mean, it really floors me actually how much information they can pull off in pretty small drawings. And you know, I used to wonder why comic books didn't just try and do like full-on realism, or why their color palettes were a little simplified. And you know, again, trying to even draw stuff in sketchbooks like this, you know, which is just a half figure, and come to realize that they draw it that way. I mean, not only because of the, I'm sure, the technical process of printing out comics and things like that, but you know, you got to start making some choices in places to capture all that information repeatedly. You know, perfect realism, it would be so hard to do for characters, you know, trying to capture, if you've blasted in someone's face so perfectly on one panel, and then you have them in a completely different pose that you have no reference for, if they're not a little caricaturized or something, then odds are you're not going to necessarily make it look like the character that well, because again, that's really hard to do. Realism often comes from great reference. So yeah, I've come to appreciate the choices comic book artists make even more now, and I understand them, but now that I've tried to draw a little bit of that myself. In my last video I drew Frankenstein, and as I was thinking about Frankenstein, you know, I think even in that video I said I'd draw something from Deadlock, the video game, as my next video. Here I am drawing Wolverine, but I was thinking of Frankenstein, and and it occurred to me that the Weapon X story is really a Frankenstein story in a way too. It is sort of meant to highlight the extreme nature of experimentation on humans, you know, kind of maybe a bit of a critique on how Nazis, or, I mean, just any, I mean, there's other experimentation that happened during World War II, some say even more horrific than what the Nazis were doing, you know, like, I'm going to be wrong, I don't know if it was in Japan or China, even if it was Japan on Chinese people, I can't remember, and so I'm not a good source of information on that, but you know, there's been, it's not unheard of in human history to basically torture people for experimentation and scientific gain. And you know, even when you think about, so the characters in Weapon X, Cornelius and again, can't remember the gal's name, are actually fairly likable. They are trying to at least honor Logan's humanity as they run him through pretty absurd tests. But you know, even in like the Stanford prison experiment, we have these examples of how people end up going along with things as long as someone's leading the cause. And in Weapon X story, it's like just a guy named the Professor. And these people who are otherwise seem pretty likable do just go along with it. And torture Logan. And try and turn him into the animal that they say he is. And so there's various scenes throughout the book of him like fighting wildlife, whether that's like a pack of wolves or a grizzly. And of course, you know, they're kind of just hoping that he will wake up and save his own life by killing these animals. And sure enough, he in fact does. And the story does get, like I said, I think I said this earlier, the story gets quite confusing as it progresses because he's basically, they're trying to control him with the thing that, this helmet, which I'll be drawing. Alright, so I decided if I was going to talk about the helmet, then I should at least be drawing it. So anyways, he has this helmet that they put on him, which they're kind of using as a mind control type of device. It's almost like a VR headset these days. And it's kind of funky looking in the comics. It's cool, it's really well designed. It's like, it reminds me of how the Matrix went about things, like with a bunch of wires and cables. Very, I don't even know what you call it, but just very mechanical looking, that you can just kind of see everything that's gone into it is exposed. There's no user interface or utility. It's just completely, it's just supposed to be this functional thing. It's cumbersome, has these heavy batteries on it, which one of the doctors remarks, you know, is like an unfair disadvantage for Logan in these altercations he's getting in with wildlife. But you know, the Professor, he does not care. He's just happy that Weapon X is taking care of business. And for sure, Logan is. He's just kind of slaughtering stuff. And of course, the story has a time in which, you know, Logan kind of breaches containment. And he's no longer under the mind control of the Professor. And he goes on this rampage through the facility, killing anyone and everything. And he gets to the Professor. All this is spoilers, by the way, if you want to listen to it or read it yourself. So I guess that was fairly apparent by the nature of the video. But he goes on this rampage killing everyone in the facility, and he finally comes across the 3 people who've been experimenting on him, and he kills Cornelius, who again was kind of, you know, he wasn't great, but he was better than the Professor for sure. And the Professor, he just slices his hand off, and the Professor kind of gets away. And the female he lets go, because he says he doesn't have a problem with her. And then he escapes, and you kind of think that's the end of the story. But it picks back up, and he's right back in the facility, and everyone's alive, including those 3 doctors. And so you're left feeling pretty confused, you know. A lot of times dream stories, I was told this when I was in college for my creative writing courses, dream stories can feel very dissatisfying if they don't end up shaping up and making sense pretty quickly. And you know, I could almost see that being the case with Weapon X's. Some of the stuff that happens maybe doesn't have great resolutions. So, you know, he's back in the facility, they're alive, and they kind of go down the route of like, that was all a simulation. Again, like the Matrix. And I should say this is all precedes the Matrix, so it's not, it didn't rip that concept from that franchise. Not that that franchise even has a corner on it was all a dream story concept. But it was all a simulation, you know, I guess kind of to test the potency and ferocity and humanity of Weapon X, aka Logan. And, you know, the professor, I think, is feeling pretty good about it, even though he was maimed. He wasn't killed in Logan's delusion. And then, you know, it sort of ends once again. They go through this whole thing again. And, you know, it feels a lot like the hallucination actually plays out the second time in reality. You know, they send him out on another test, and of course coming back in, you know, it's like all of a sudden there's a lockdown as they're trying to get Weapon X back into containment. And, you know, it sort of ends with Wolverine breaking into the room in which the doctors were. Not the scientists. And so once again, this time you don't know what's happening. This needs a catch now, so I'm just kind of having the light come from up here again, just kind of standard. I wanted the light when it hit his bicep to give it lots of shape in a traditional sense. So that explains the light source. I didn't want to do anything super bizarre. Just trying to make it as easy on myself as I can for YouTube videos, because in general trying to talk and work through these fairly fast, I don't need to spend too much time constantly problem solving here. So yeah, Weapon X is a tremendous comic book story. The definitive, I think, origin story for Wolverine and his adamantium. But not without some flaws, in a way. So light's coming from here. I don't really want it to go into this visor though, so it's just gonna have to be like that. The color palette that Barry Windsor Smith chose for the illustrations is just kind of wild to look at. At times it doesn't make a lot of sense. That's not to say it's not bad. It's just like the colors are so strong and so bizarre and not at all realistic. And you know, that might be to highlight the sort of fever dream state that Logan is in, or that the facility is like. And for that I think it's effective, because Logan's reality, wearing that headset, is sort of digitized and filtered, and he can't trust what is happening. And so for the art to look the way it does, you know, I think it's easily possible it's a reflection on just how skewed Logan's world is to him as he suffers in this facility. And just because Wolverine has that super healing does not mean he's not suffering the entire time during that adamantium bonding process, because he can't speak much, but when he does speak, even in the tank and stuff, he's yelling pain, pain, pain. It doesn't stop them though. They just want to see the fruits of their theory and labor. The story also ends with Wolverine having gotten out of the facility and just kind of roaming the wintry landscape wherever that facility was. All this stuff is a little more known as they built upon it in later comics, but none of this stuff is explicitly said, so far as I can remember, in the Weapon X comic itself, you know. Like, the facility might be in like Ontario, Canada, which would explain some of the environment, but it's not really said in the Weapon X comic that we're talking about here. You know, it's something that was elaborated on much later. It's also implied by the professor, possibly, he claims it was a ruse, that someone else outside the facility may have been in charge of the whole project of Weapon X. And so you can't really ever even know who is pulling the strings on this project and why. Like, why is a Weapon X required? What's its purpose? They even sort of ask that, Cornelius does, of the professor, and there's no good answer given of like, oh yeah, he's going to be a super soldier for the military to fight in the Cold War or something. There's no real great answer given. It's just kind of a nebulous, and I don't know if that is, you know, left ambiguous just as a storytelling element, or because Barry Windsor Smith himself didn't know and just adds intrigue, or if it's a commentary on the purposelessness of some of the things we set out to do in this world that maybe are kind of cruel and unusual and torturous. I would like to think that writers generally do everything with kind of a high level of purpose. You know, I give writers a ton of respect, and so I'm going to assume that it's just kind of a commentary on the lack of reason we have for a lot of things that we do in this world. Alright, I'm going to start blasting in some more just overall shape here. Helmet's pretty circular, so my pencil strokes are going to move in a way that helps show that direction, because we need it rounding over right here. This is kind of like approaching what would be the temple type region. So I'm going to blend it in that sort of way as well. And I don't want the value to be as high as this side, because this side, number one, has these raised bizarre shapes on it, which I didn't copy the Weapon X helmet one for one by any means. I just took some elements, I simplified some in other areas, and you know, I kind of did my own thing. So I want a lot of the attention to be on this side. Not only is that the side that the light's coming from, but I'm just trying to give form to some of the stuff that deserves less attention. So I have these posts sticking up, or like in the helmet in the comic, not posts, they're more like these camera monitors, maybe sensors of some variety. And down here, can't see it maybe, in graphite I have these other like electrode like type things. I have this cable that ambiguously goes from the helmet to his chest. I don't know, I was trying to show that various things are being monitored. I'm not as good of an artist as Barry Windsor Smith by any means, so I'm not gonna try and draw as much crazy stuff as he did. That's one thing I noticed in his art, is he had a really cohesive design language for all of this stuff. Not only the Weapon X sort of stuff, you know, he has battery packs he's wearing or something on his hip, but the laboratory, all of it has this cool, I don't know, very utility-esque look to everything. Of like, it's just pure function. It's not about looking sleek or cool. It reminds me a lot of Alien, like the kind of retro techie futures that the Alien and Blade Runner type movies envisioned, of everything just functional, not the way it turned out, obviously, where we value very clearly design aesthetic and, you know, like the white iPhone, that some of that stuff is kind of the antithesis of design. It's actually like, in my mind, it can be, yeah, it's like the absence of it. It's just too, and so you don't have to think too much. But everything in Barry Windsor Smith's book is very messy, still with purpose, but just a lot of chaos technologically. So I think I've also come to realize, and it has a lot to do with trying to once again draw more complex things. Charcoal is probably not, and it's not an excuse, I don't think, but this is not the best medium to draw tons of precise things and shade it. Alright guys, welcome back. I'm pretty much at the end here. I've been doing a lot of guessing and figuring out, and overall I'm not too displeased with the results. It's a lot of difficult detail areas with charcoal, which can be really challenging. This isn't that big of a page, it's 11 by 14. So, you know, I had to figure out the abdomen here, and I found a picture of Evander Holyfield throwing an uppercut, which I kind of use as reference. It's not the right angle, but just trying to use that as inspiration, since Evander Holyfield was obviously very in shape. You know, a lot of suspicion around his usage. And you know, I feel like the pose came out a little stiff, like I suspected, since his arm is more tucked and not quite. His elbow had been up here, which is how I had the sketch, you know, that brings his arm kind of to the edge of the page over here. And so subconsciously I was trying to avoid that, but it means his arm's a little more tucked, so it's not as dynamic of a pose, you know. It looks a little more like he's just looking at his claws being exerted as opposed to actually the gesture of throwing an uppercut, which was kind of what I was going for in the beginning. Like I said, when you are just copying something, which I was copying my sketch, which came from a place of, you know, when you're sketching, you're actually really problem solving and figuring out, you know, how things work. And I just kind of, I'd done that sketch so long ago, I kind of forgot the overall thrust of what I was going after there.